The curtains of Leighton Court, a grand but fading Edwardian townhouse in the heart of Belgravia, had always been drawn. It was a peculiarity the neighbors whispered about for years, a mansion sealed from sunlight, occupied by a woman who, by her own choice, had not opened a window in 23 years. That woman was Mrs. Cordelia Armitage, wealthy, elegant, widowed, and notoriously private. She lived alone except for a small household staff and her distant nephew. For decades, she remained an enigma. She was glimpsed only on rare occasions, stepping into a carriage, accepting a parcel at the door, or speaking briefly with her solicitor. Beyond that, she might as well have been a ghost haunting her own home. On the evening of October 11th, however, the secrecy of Leighton Court shattered, quite literally. At precisely 8:13 p.m., a scream rang out from the house. Neighbors rushed to their windows. A maid was pounding on the front door, shrieking for help. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered outside the imposing black door. By the time the police forced their way in, Mrs. Armitage was found dead in her private sitting room, her body slumped near the fireplace, her face drained of color, her hands tightly clutching the arms of her velvet chair. But the most astonishing detail was not her death. It was the position of a single window in the room, a window that had been opened. After more than 2 decades of being sealed, bolted, and covered with heavy drapes, that window was open to the night air, its curtains fluttering like dark wings, and Mrs. Armitage was dead beneath it. The official conclusion from the first inspector on the scene was simple and uninspired. Heart failure, the shock of the cold air after years of seclusion. But even the inspector admitted in lowered voice that something felt wrong. The window latch was snapped as if broken from the outside. A strange scent lingered in the room, floral, sharp, unfamiliar. And most peculiar of all, on the far side of the fireplace, a delicate porcelain figurine lay shattered into dozens of pieces. It didn't look like the scene of a natural death. It looked like the aftermath of a struggle. By morning, several individuals connected to Mrs. Armitage were summoned or had arrived uninvited, each with their own anxieties, motives, and secrets. 1. Henry Whitcomb. Her nephew, a polished but nervous young man in his early 30s. He was her only living relative and stood to inherit the estate. He claimed he had not visited her in weeks. The servants disputed that. 2. Miss Eleanor Bexley, the loyal but stiff housekeeper who had served Mrs. Armitage for 15 years. Her dedication bordered on obsession, and she spoke of her mistress as though she were a sacred relic. 3. Mrs. Nora Lytton, the neighbor across the street, known for her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue. She swore she saw a shadowy figure slipping through the side gate an hour before. The scream. 4. Dr. Lionel Ashcroft, Mrs. Armitage's personal physician, who had long urged her to allow fresh air into the home. He insisted her death was due to long-standing health issues. He also looked peculiarly nervous about the broken porcelain figurine. 5. Mr. Basil Harrington, her solicitor, summoned by the police to identify specific documents found in her writing desk. He arrived pale and trembling, claiming he had a difficult conversation with Mrs. Armitage just 2 days before her death. Each of them had been connected to the woman who never opened her windows. Each of them had something to hide, and yet none could explain why the window had been forced open that night, or what had driven Mrs. Armitage to sit beneath it, facing the cold air she had feared for more than half her life. 2 days before her death, Mrs. Armitage had written a letter addressed to a Belgian detective of great reputation. The household staff did not know its contents. They only knew she insisted it must be posted immediately. The letter never reached the post. It lay sealed in a drawer of her writing desk. The police, in their haste to declare natural causes, did not bother to open it. But later that afternoon, a small, impeccably dressed man with a waxed mustache, a shining hat, and a cane of polished ebony stepped out of a taxi in front of Leighton Court. His presence felt at once unusual and inevitable, as if the story had been waiting for him. He showed his card to the constable at the door, Hercule Poirot. Poirot stepped into the dim, heavy atmosphere of the mansion. The air felt stale, not merely from the lack of ventilation, but from decades of secrets clinging to the walls like dust. He paused in the hallway, his keen eyes scanning the floorboards, the carpet, the arrangement of umbrellas in the stand. "The house," Poirot murmured, "has the feel of a mind that fears disorder." He was led to the sitting room where Mrs. Armitage had died. Poirot's gaze moved not to the body, which had already been taken away, but to the open window. He touched the broken latch. He examined the drapes, noting the way they curved inward, faintly, as if disturbed long after the window was opened. He knelt to observe the shards of porcelain scattered across the rug. "Someone," he whispered, "lost their temper." Poirot's eyes narrowed. But what intrigued him most was a small scrap of paper partially tucked beneath the chair cushion, a torn corner of an envelope bearing the unmistakable handwriting of Mrs. Armitage. It matched the letter in the desk. Poirot retrieved it. "The lady writes to Hercule Poirot," he murmured. "But why does she tear the envelope? Why does she hide the window key in her shoe? Why does she cling to the armrests as she dies?" His gaze drifted to the open window. "And why, after 23 years of darkness," he whispered, "does she greet the night air on the last evening of her life?" Poirot stood still, his eyes gleaming with the quiet certainty of a man who felt the presence of murder long before it was proven. The woman who never opened her windows had opened one at last, and someone had made certain she would not close it again. Inspector Graves, a square-shouldered man with a clipped mustache and an air of weary practicality, watched Hercule Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and faint irritation. "You're a bit late to the party, Monsieur Poirot," he remarked. "The doctors called it heart failure. Nothing to do for us but the paperwork." Poirot, seated delicately at the small escritoire, raised his eyes without lifting his head. "Ah, but you English, you're always so eager to tidy away the ugly things, like putting the dust under the carpet, n'est-ce pas?" Graves frowned. "Her physician says she had a weak heart. No sign of forced entry, no valuables missing, no visible wounds. Yes, the window is odd. But people do odd things before they die." Poirot's fingers rested lightly upon the sealed envelope he had just taken from the drawer. "And what of the letter addressed to Hercule Poirot that was not posted, Inspector? Is that also one of the odd little things?" Graves shifted his weight. "I was going to look into that. Eventually." Poirot smiled faintly. "But of course, eventually is a word that has seen many crimes escape justice." He turned the envelope over with gentle fingertips, noting the precise slant of the handwriting, the heavy cream paper. He did not open it. "Not yet." "To permit me to examine, yes?" he asked. Graves sighed. "I suppose if the lady wanted you, she must have had her reasons. But I'll ask you to share anything of relevance." "Inspector, I shall share everything of relevance," Poirot replied softly. "But first, I must know what is relevant." Graves tugged at his cuff. "Since you're here, I might as well tell you what the surgeon found when they examined her body." He took out a small notebook and flipped it open. "Cause of death remains inconclusive," Graves read. "Heart failure possible, but not certain. No marks of violence on the body. However," he peered closer, "note, a small brass key found concealed inside the right shoe of the deceased." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Ah, so it is confirmed. A key in her shoe." He leaned forward, his voice thoughtful. "And you have tested the key?" "Yes. It belongs to that window." Graves jerked his chin toward the tall sash window, still slightly ajar despite the autumn chill. "Locked from the inside, bolted for years, they say. That key was supposed to be kept in a box in her desk. It wasn't. It was in her shoe." Poirot rose and walked to the window, his footsteps making the faintest sound on the thick carpet. A woman who fears the air, he murmured, who lives in darkness, and yet she keeps the key to her window, not in a drawer, not on her person, but hidden in her shoe. Why? Because she fears it might be used, or because she intends to use it herself and trusts no one. He turned back to Graves. Who first entered this room after the scream? The maid, Rose Parker, Graves replied. Then the butler. Then Miss Bexley, the housekeeper. The doctor came shortly after. Bon. Then we shall see them, all of them. The household first, before the fine relations and the neighbors with their observations and their imaginations. His moustache twitched. And if you please, Inspector, no one leaves the house until I have spoken to them. It is not yet certain that Madame Armitage died of natural causes. Graves looked as though he wanted to argue, then thought better of it. Something in Poirot's gaze, calm, assured, unhurried, had the solidity of a verdict already forming. I'll have them assembled in the drawing room, he grunted. Merci, Inspector. We will gather the little company, like pieces on a chessboard, and see who chooses which square. The drawing room of Leighton Court was a grand but tired chamber. High ceilings, faded wallpaper, heavy furniture that seemed to resent being disturbed. Poirot stood near the marble fireplace as the people were brought in, one by one. They did not yet know it, but they were suspects. Miss Eleanor Bexley, the housekeeper, entered first. She was tall, angular, with tightly pinned hair and a mouth set in a line that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. Her hands were folded, her eyes, coldly efficient, flicked over Poirot as if evaluating an unfamiliar piece of furniture. Behind her came Rose Parker, the maid, a slight girl with pale eyes and blotchy cheeks. She clutched a handkerchief, twisting it nervously. James Wilcox, the butler, followed. Thin, upright, almost skeletal in his dignity, he seemed carved from old tradition and quiet disapproval. Then the outer circle arrived. Henry Whitcomb, the nephew, nervous, overgroomed, his tie too tight, his smile too quick. His face bore the marks of recent sleepless nights, or perhaps recent worries. Mrs. Nora Lytton, the neighbor, short, plump, with bright, darting eyes that missed nothing and forgave even less. She glanced around with barely restrained curiosity, as though she had at last been admitted to a theater behind the scenes. Dr. Lionel Ashcroft entered with the solemn air of a man who feels tragedy belongs under his professional jurisdiction. His hair was graying at the temples, his features handsome but strained. Finally, Mr. Basil Harrington, the solicitor, arrived. Tall, thin, with a pinched face and fingers that could not keep still. They took their seats with varying degrees of stiffness and reluctance. Poirot allowed a moment of silence to settle. Silence, he knew, was often as revealing as speech. Mesdames, Messieurs, he said at last, his voice smooth and pleasantly accented. I am Hercule Poirot. It appears that Madame Armitage wrote to consult me. She did not live to post her letter. That is a thing that troubles me greatly. He looked from face to face, noting the reactions. Surprise, irritation, fear, curiosity. The police consider that her death may be of natural cause, he continued. I, Hercule Poirot, am not yet convinced. Therefore, I must ask you all some small questions, yes? We shall be orderly. We shall be calm. We shall be precise. There will be no confusion. He turned slightly. We begin with the maid, Mademoiselle Rose Parker. Rose swallowed hard and rose from her chair, clasping her crumpled handkerchief. Now, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, you were the first to find Madame Armitage, were you not? Yes, sir, she whispered. I heard her scream. From where did you hear it? From the corridor. I was bringing her tray, her cocoa. I do that every night at 8 o'clock. Ah, a routine. And tonight did anything disturb this routine? Rose hesitated. Well? Inspector Graves prompted. Rose's fingers tightened. She seemed different earlier. Mrs. Armitage, I mean. She sent for Miss Bexley twice in the afternoon. Then she made me close the curtains earlier than usual. And she kept looking at the window. Poirot's eyebrow lifted. She spoke of the window. Not exactly, sir. But when I brought her tea, I saw her staring at it. The windows are always covered. I've never seen them open. Never. She was pale, like she'd seen a ghost. Poirot nodded slowly. Tell me of the scream. I was outside the door. I had the tray in my hands. I heard her cry out. Just once. Like she was frightened. I dropped the tray and ran in. The room was dark, but the window... She shuddered. The window was open, and she was in her chair, her hands gripping it. Her eyes... They were wrong. She was gone, sir. I knew she was gone. Was anyone else near the room when you entered? Rose thought. No, sir. But I did hear footsteps on the stairs a few minutes before. I thought it was Mr. Whitcomb. He'd come to visit, but when I looked, there was no one. Henry Whitcomb stiffened. I arrived after 8, he said sharply. I signed in with Wilcox, the butler. We shall verify, Poirot said mildly. Merci, Mademoiselle Rose. You have been very helpful. He watched her carefully as she sat, noting the genuine tremor in her hands, the confusion rather than calculation in her eyes. Now, Mademoiselle Bexley. The housekeeper rose, her back as straight as a ruler. You served Madame Armitage for 15 years, Poirot said. Tell me, was she a woman easily frightened? Mrs. Armitage had certain anxieties, Miss Bexley replied in a dry, precise voice. She disliked drafts, crowds, noise, and strangers. But she was not weak. She was firm, decisive, and accustomed to being obeyed. And the windows? Poirot asked. They have been kept closed and locked since her husband's death, Miss Bexley replied. It was her wish. We all respected it. Why? Miss Bexley's mouth tightened. Because something terrible happened, and she saw no reason to invite the world in again. A burglary, an assault, Poirot probed. A tragedy, Miss Bexley said shortly. One that is not your concern, monsieur. Poirot's eyes glinted. On the contrary, mademoiselle, every tragedy of the past is the concern of Hercule Poirot when it casts a shadow upon the present. He let the words hang, then continued, Tell me of the key in her shoe. You kept the keys of the house? Yes. The key to that window was kept in a locked box in a separate drawer, Mrs. Armitage insisted. And when did you last see it there? 2 days ago. I check every evening. So in the day before her death, someone removed it. Either Mrs. Armitage herself or another person with access to the drawer. Poirot tapped his lip. And Madame Armitage, did she leave her room yesterday afternoon? Miss Bexley hesitated almost imperceptibly. She remained upstairs, as usual. Are you quite certain, mademoiselle? Her jaw tightened. I did not see her leave. That is what I can say. Poirot inclined his head. Very well, merci. He glanced around the room, letting the first web of contradictions settle in his mind. A woman afraid of the outside world keeps the key to her window hidden in her shoe. She stares at that same window on the afternoon of her death. The maid hears footsteps where no one claims to have been. The housekeeper speaks of a tragedy no one wishes to name. And somewhere among them, Poirot thought, was the person who had opened the window and closed the chapter on Cordelia Armitage's life. Now, he said pleasantly, we shall speak to the doctor and then to Monsieur Whitcomb. I think, Inspector, that you will soon see this is no ordinary death at all. The first false trail was already forming in the room, coiling itself neatly around one of the suspects. Poirot, watching closely, allowed it to grow. The drawing room grew colder, though no window was open. Tension has a way of seeping into the walls, and Leighton Court had been swallowing secrets for decades. Poirot, however, stood untouched by the atmosphere. He smoothed the lapel of his impeccable grey suit and gestured toward the doctor. "Dr. Lionel Ashcroft, if you please." The physician rose with clinical calm, though a faint nervousness twitched at the corner of his eye. A subtle flicker Poirot did not miss. "Doctor," Poirot began, clasping his hands neatly, "you were Mrs. Armitage's attending physician for how long?" 7 years, Monsieur Poirot," Dr. Ashcroft replied. "She suffered from anxiety, chronic insomnia, and a delicate constitution. Her heart, well, it was not as strong as it once was." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you continued to urge her to open the windows in her room, did you not?" A soft gasp came from the maid. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed. The doctor cleared his throat. "It is true she lived in a manner rather removed from the world," he said, "but fresh air would have done her good." Poirot stepped closer. "And what did she say to that?" "She refused, always. She seemed terrified of drafts." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Terrified, you say? A strong word. Did she tell you why?" Dr. Ashcroft hesitated. He adjusted his glasses. "There are events in her past that caused great distress. I believed it best not to press her." Poirot studied him, head tilted ever so slightly. "And yesterday, doctor, did you visit her?" "Yes," Ashcroft replied. "At 5 o'clock." "And did you find her as usual?" Another hesitation. Poirot pressed, "Doctor?" "She was unsettled," he admitted. Her pulse was rapid. She kept asking whether I smelled something in the room. "What sort of smell?" "A sharp, sweet fragrance." Poirot's eyes sharpened. Rose Parker, the maid, clutched her handkerchief. "And did you smell it?" "No, I detected nothing unusual." Poirot paced a small line before the fireplace. "This is curious. The maid describes a strange scent in the room after the death, and Madame herself complains of a smell hours earlier. Yet you, doctor, smell nothing." Dr. Ashcroft stiffened as though feeling cornered. "My senses are quite adequate, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot said nothing, but the faintest hint of amusement flickered in his gaze. "Mr. Basil Harrington," Poirot announced. The solicitor sprang up as though stung. His fingers played nervously with each other, interlacing and twisting. Poirot spoke gently. "You had, I believe, a difficult conversation with Madame Armitage 2 days before her death." Harrington's face paled. "How did you—" Poirot tapped the envelope still lying on the small table beside him. "It is, I find, often enlightening to observe the ephemera of a person's last days. Papers, letters, notes, they whisper, Monsieur Harrington." Harrington swallowed. "Yes," he finally said. "I visited her on the 9th. She summoned me unexpectedly. She had a matter she wished to resolve, though she was vague about it." "And what matter was that?" Harrington hesitated. Poirot stepped closer. Come. "The truth, if you please." "She wished to alter her will." Every head in the room snapped toward him. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, and to whose benefit?" Harrington wiped his brow. Her nephew, Henry Whitcomb, was to inherit nearly everything. A few smaller bequests to the servants, and a maintenance fund for the property. She wished to dissolve a trust that provided him yearly allowances. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. She wished to revoke her nephew's financial support? "Yes," Harrington whispered. Whitcomb shot up from his seat. "This is absurd. I knew nothing of this." Poirot held up a hand. "We shall speak to you shortly, Monsieur Whitcomb. Sit." Whitcomb sat, though trembling with anger. "Doctor," Poirot said suddenly, "did Madame Armitage seem well enough in mind to make such a decision?" "Yes," Dr. Ashcroft replied stiffly. "Quite lucid." Poirot looked back to Harrington. "And did she give her reason?" Harrington hesitated. "She said she suspected someone was deceiving her." Someone close. A ripple spread through the room. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "And you, Monsieur Harrington, did you believe her?" Harrington shook his head slowly. "Frankly, Poirot, I believed she was imagining things." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "But now?" The solicitor looked around the room. "Now I'm not so certain." At last, Poirot turned toward Henry Whitcomb. Whitcomb stood before he was even called. "Monsieur Poirot, I assure you I had nothing to do with my aunt's death." Poirot lifted a single, immaculate eyebrow. "Guilt is not established by who speaks first, Monsieur Whitcomb, nor by who protests the loudest. Sit, I shall ask. You shall answer." Whitcomb sat again, clasping his hands tightly. Poirot moved to stand directly before him. "You were expected yesterday." "Yes, I visit my aunt every Wednesday." "And did you arrive at your usual time?" Whitcomb hesitated. "I was delayed. I arrived at 8:15, I think. I signed in with the butler." Poirot turned to the butler. "Monsieur Wilcox, is this correct?" Wilcox gave a stiff nod. "Yes, sir. Henry Whitcomb arrived at 8:13. "Precisely 8:13? Poirot asked. "Yes, sir. I remember checking the clock." Poirot froze. The room held its breath. 8:13, he repeated softly. The exact minute the scream was heard. Whitcomb's face drained of color. "I swear I was not upstairs," he cried. "I was in the hall with Wilcox. Ask him." Wilcox nodded. "He was indeed with me, sir." Poirot tapped his chin. "Curious," he murmured. "But that proves I wasn't there," Whitcomb insisted. Poirot did not answer. He walked toward the window and touched the broken latch. "Perhaps," he said lightly, "or perhaps someone wishes us to believe you arrived at precisely that time." A murmur swept through the room. Whitcomb stared. "You think someone forged the time?" Poirot shrugged elegantly. "I think, mon ami, that time is the easiest thing in the world to manipulate." He turned suddenly and pointed toward the sofa. "Miss Bexley," he said sharply, "where were you at 8:13? The housekeeper stiffened. "In the kitchen, preparing Madame's evening pills." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Were you alone?" "Yes." "In a household full of people?" Poirot said quietly. "How convenient." Miss Bexley's nostrils flared. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot waved a hand. "I accuse no one. I merely tidy the facts." He walked toward the center of the room. "And one fact, mes amis, stands out like a candle in a dark cellar." He raised a single finger. "Someone tampered with the clock in the hall." Gasps erupted across the room. Poirot continued. "Wilcox believes Whitcomb arrived at 8:13 because the clock displayed 8:13. But the maid heard footsteps on the stairs 5 minutes earlier, footsteps no one else will claim. Madame Armitage died at approximately 8 minus 5 minutes. Whitcomb stared at Poirot as though drowning. "You mean someone wanted me to arrive at the exact moment of the scream?" Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Oui, the first false lead. The murderer wished to plant a neat little seed of suspicion." Poirot turned, eyes sweeping the room. "And now, it begins to grow." A pin-drop silence filled the drawing room. The suspects sat frozen, each calculating what Poirot's accusation implied. But Poirot did not linger. He had learned long ago that when one drops a stone into a pond, the ripples must be allowed to spread on their own. "Inspector Graves," he said softly, "would you be so kind as to bring me the clock from the hall?" The inspector blinked. "Bring it. Here." Poirot nodded. "If you please. It has a role to play in our little drama." Graves grunted but obeyed. When he returned, carrying the brass-framed mantel clock, its ticking seemed suddenly too loud for the room. Poirot examined it as though it were a relic of great antiquity. "Ah," he murmured, turning it over. "The face is clean, the casing polished, but inside—" He tapped the back panel with one elegant fingernail. "Someone has left a fingerprint." Inspector Graves startled. You can see that without dusting it? Poirot gave him a patient smile. No, mon ami. I simply see the smudge where someone removed a fingerprint. Very hurriedly. A ripple of unease swept through the room. Poirot placed the clock gently upon the table, its tick-tick-tick punctuating every breath. Now, he said, turning to face all of them, we shall continue. We have heard of the scream, the window, the key, and the fragrance that no one smelled but the maid and Madame Armitage. He clasped his hands behind his back. But now we must examine motive. He pointed gracefully toward Henry Whitcomb. Monsieur Whitcomb, your aunt was about to change her will. Whitcomb flinched. Yes, apparently. But I didn't know. Oh, but that does not matter, Poirot replied. What matters is that her death prevents the change. You inherit everything. Whitcomb swallowed. Are you saying I killed her for money? Poirot tilted his head. I'm saying that whoever killed her wishes us to believe that. A collective exhale whispered through the room. Poirot continued, Your arrival at the minute of her scream is most unfortunate. Your alibi rests upon the butler's certainty, and the butler himself relies upon a clock. He gestured delicately. Which lies? Wilcox stiffened. Monsieur Poirot, I assure you. Poirot cut him off gently. You assure me of nothing except that you looked at a timepiece that no longer tells the truth. Whitcomb looked sick. Miss Bexley looked triumphant. Mrs. Lytton was nearly vibrating with gossip-rich delight. Poirot walked slowly, elegantly, hands clasped, as though strolling through a garden. Now, Henry Whitcomb, there is something else. You visited your aunt last week, did you not? Whitcomb's eyes widened. Yes, but... And during that visit, you argued. Whitcomb froze. Mrs. Lytton let out a small "oh" of satisfaction. Who told you that? Whitcomb asked weakly. Poirot smiled faintly. No one. You told me. Your voice, your nerves, your sweat when we mentioned the will, they speak louder than your words. He paused. What did you argue about? Whitcomb looked around, cornered, then let his shoulders slump. She accused me of taking money from her account. Gasps spread like fire. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And did you? No. Someone used her checkbook, but she thought it was me. I tried to tell her. She refused to listen. She threatened to cut me off completely. That's why she called for Mr. Harrington. Poirot nodded slowly. Oui, a motive. Oh, a strong motive indeed. Enough to make any man appear guilty. Whitcomb's voice cracked. But I didn't kill her. Poirot's gaze stayed neutral, unreadable. We shall see. Poirot turned suddenly toward Miss Bexley. Now, mademoiselle, it is time for you. Miss Bexley rose like a pillar of iron, though a tremor betrayed her stoic mask. You served Madame Armitage faithfully for 15 years, Poirot began. You protected her routines, her comforts, her fears. You saw to it that no window was opened. Ever. Miss Bexley's chin lifted. She wished it so. But did she wish it yesterday? Poirot asked softly. Or did she attempt to open her past at last? Miss Bexley faltered. I don't know what you mean. Oh, but I think you do. Poirot stepped closer. The tragedy you refused to speak of. Her husband's death. The reason she sealed the house. You knew it all. You kept her world intact. He paused. You controlled that world. Miss Bexley bristled. I served her. Poirot nodded. Yes, devotedly. But sometimes devotion turns to something else. Something possessive. Something jealous of change. Miss Bexley's hands twisted together. I had nothing to do with her death. Perhaps not directly, Poirot said lightly, but you disliked that she summoned me. You disliked that she spoke to the solicitor, and most of all, he leaned in. You disliked that she began asking questions about the past again. The housekeeper's face went white. Poirot stepped back. You did not kill her, Miss Bexley. but you hide something that someone else may have used." Miss Bexley collapsed back into her seat, shaken. The psychological game had begun. "Mrs. Nora Lytton," Poirot said brightly. She straightened eagerly. She lived for moments like this. "Madame, you saw someone, did you not? The night of the murder?" Mrs. Lytton nodded vigorously. "Yes, a shadowy figure at the side gate. I saw it clearly." Poirot smiled kindly. "Madame, you see shadows in the best light. You see movement where there is stillness. The human imagination, especially one as sharp as yours, is a vibrant thing." Mrs. Lytton bristled. "Are you saying I imagined it?" Poirot tapped his mustache. "I'm saying only this. A shadow is not a person, and a figure is not a face." The neighbor deflated, sinking into her chair. "And yet," Poirot added softly, "someone did use that gate." Every head turned. Poirot's eyes glinted. "The latch bears fresh scoring. Someone forced it from outside within the last day or two. Someone came and went, unseen, unnoticed." A hush swept the room. This was new. This was dangerous. "And now," Poirot continued, turning elegantly, "we must speak to the butler." James Wilcox stood tall, hands folded with ceremonial dignity. "Monsieur Wilcox," Poirot said, "you have been with this household for 12 years. "Yes, monsieur." "You are organized, punctual, precise, a butler of the old school." "Thank you, sir." Poirot leaned in slightly. "Then tell me, why was the hall clock 6 minutes slow?" A flicker, tiny but fatal, crossed Wilcox's face. I don't know." Poirot stepped closer. "You check the clocks every morning, do you not?" "Yes." "And yesterday morning was the clock slow?" "No." Poirot smiled gently. "Ah, so it became slow only in the evening. How curious." He walked in a slow circle around Wilcox. "Someone adjusted it. Someone who knew it would give a false alibi to Monsieur Whitcomb." Wilcox stiffened. "I would never—" But Poirot cut him off softly, almost tenderly. "No, Monsieur Wilcox. You are not clever enough to tamper with a clock and coordinate footsteps and manipulate a window latch." Wilcox blinked. Poirot finished, "But you are loyal enough to obey someone else." A tremor spread through the room. Someone had enlisted the butler. Someone had planned the misdirection. Someone in this very room. Poirot turned slowly, his eyes drifting from face to face, absorbing every twitch, every tightening jaw, every flicker of panic. Poirot clasped his hands serenely. "Mes amis, we are now ready." "Ready for what?" Inspector Graves asked. Poirot smiled, the small, satisfied smile of a man who sees the board 3 moves ahead. "To identify the person who most certainly did not kill Madame Armitage." The room froze. Whitcomb leaned forward. "Who?" Poirot lifted his chin, his voice smooth as silk. "Henry Whitcomb." Gasps exploded. Whitcomb sagged in relief. Miss Bexley nearly fainted. Mrs. Lytton dropped her handbag. Dr. Ashcroft muttered something under his breath. Poirot raised a hand. "But do not be too relieved, mes amis." His voice softened to a dangerous whisper. "For the real killer sits in this room." The shock of Poirot's declaration rippled through the drawing room like a sudden chill. Henry Whitcomb sagged into his chair, relief and terror blending on his pale face. The others exchanged glances. Some surprised, some confused, some far too controlled. Poirot, however, stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind him as though waiting for the second wave of emotion to pass. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "If Henry didn't kill her, then who did?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, mon ami. You English policemen, you wish the answer before the question has even finished forming. Patience. The truth is not a rabbit to be pulled from the hat." He stepped away from the hearth, pacing slowly toward the door. "We must continue with the investigation, and now, I think, we shall take a A sudden, sharp crash echoed through the corridor outside. Everyone jumped. Poirot stopped mid-sentence. Inspector Graves was already moving, hand on his pocket baton. "What was that?" Miss Bexley gasped, clutching her throat. "A disturbance," Poirot murmured. "A small one, I hope." But the tone of his voice suggested he did not expect it to be small at all. They rushed into the corridor. The sound had come from the upper landing, the same floor where Mrs. Armitage had kept her sitting room, her bedroom, and her private sanctuary of locked drawers and sealed curtains. Poirot ascended the stairs with surprising speed for a man of his age and meticulous gait. Graves followed, then the suspects, though Poirot raised a hand sharply at them. "No one touches anything," he warned. The landing was in disarray. A vase lay shattered on the floor, water slowly spreading across the wooden boards. A trail of droplets, fresh, glistening, led toward the far end of the hallway. Poirot bent over the broken porcelain. This vase was not pushed by accident. His fingers hovered above the fragments. It was struck. Hard. Inspector Graves scanned the hallway. "Where's Wilcox?" Indeed, the butler was nowhere in sight. Miss Bexley covered her mouth. "He was behind us downstairs. I thought he was behind us." Poirot straightened. "No, Monsieur Wilcox was the last to leave the room, and he left through the other door." He pointed to the servants' staircase. The door stood ajar. Poirot did not touch it. Instead, he stepped closer and examined the base of the doorframe. His eyes narrowed. "A thread," he murmured. He plucked a small, dark fiber free. "From a wool coat. Not Wilcox's." Inspector Graves frowned. "Then whose?" Before Poirot could answer, a voice shrieked from the far end of the hall, "Here, come quickly!" It was Rose, the maid. Poirot and Graves bolted toward her. Rose stood trembling beside the door to the small linen closet. She pointed with a shaking hand inside. Poirot leaned forward. Inside the narrow space, slumped unnaturally against the shelves of folded sheets, was James Wilcox, unconscious or dead. Poirot knelt instantly. "Inspector, the pulse." Graves checked. "Alive. Barely." Poirot examined the butler's head. No blood, no wound. "This is not a blow," he murmured. "This is poisoning." The hall erupted in terrified gasps. Poirot rose slowly, his face shadowed with grim certainty. "The murderer grows desperate," he said softly. Someone feared Wilcox might reveal something, or already had. Poirot slipped a gloved hand carefully into Wilcox's jacket. Inspector Graves protested, "Poirot!" "Shh. The truth waits for no warrant." He withdrew a small folded paper, crumpled, damp from Wilcox's sweat. Poirot opened it. The room held its breath. It was a note, handwritten, a single sentence. "Meet me by the window latch at 8. Miss Bexley gasped. Dr. Ashcroft swallowed hard. Henry Whitcomb stared, horrified. Poirot raised a finger. "And observe, mes amis, there is no signature." Rose whispered, "Who would write that?" Poirot smiled thinly. "Someone who wished Wilcox to be in the room at the exact moment Madame Armitage died." Inspector Graves frowned deeply. "So Wilcox was summoned to the crime scene?" Poirot nodded. "Oui. And now someone has tried to silence him before he could tell us what happened." "But who?" Henry whispered. Poirot looked around slowly, his gaze drifting from face to face. "We are not ready yet," he said quietly. "But soon." Poirot re-entered Mrs. Armitage's sitting room. He did not speak for nearly a minute. He simply walked. He touched nothing, but he observed everything. The window latch, the drapes, the chair where the old woman died, the broken porcelain figure, the faint floral scent still clinging to the air. Then his eyes drifted upward, toward the chandelier. Without warning, Poirot turned sharply toward the room's far corner. There, behind a small escritoire, something caught the light. He approached, bent, picked it up. A tiny glass vial. Empty. Poirot held it up to the chandelier light. Inspector Graves inhaled sharply. "Is that—" Poirot nodded. "A vial of essential oil. A rare blend, I think. Jasmine, bellflower, and something sharp." "The smell the maid mentioned," Graves murmured. Poirot pocketed the vial. "And now we know," he said softly, "that the scent Madame Armitage spoke of was not imagined. Someone introduced it into her room. Someone who knew it would unnerve her." Dr. Ashcroft stepped forward abruptly. "Many elderly women use oils to calm themselves." Poirot turned slowly. "But Madame Armitage feared fragrances. The housekeeper confirmed it. She demanded unscented soaps, unscented candles. She dismissed a maid once for bringing perfumed flowers into the house." Dr. Ashcroft froze. Poirot's voice remained calm. "So why," he asked, "would she use this?" Silence. Dead silence. Poirot stepped closer to the doctor. "Unless she did not use it." Poirot returned to the window. He touched the latch, examined the broken brass. And then he bent lower. His eyes gleamed. A thin, faint scratch ran along the inside sill, not on the outer frame, not where a person would break in, but on the inside. Poirot's voice, when he spoke, was soft and cold. "This window was opened from the inside." Inspector Graves blinked. "But the latch was broken." "No," Poirot corrected. "It was made to appear broken, a clever illusion. Look, see how the break is shallow? Cosmetic. Made quickly. Made with a tool that was drawn carefully outward." He traced the scratch with one fingertip. "This mark is fresh. Very fresh. The murderer wanted us to believe they entered from outside." Poirot straightened. In truth, they were already in the room. The room chilled. Rose whispered, "Inside. One of us?" Poirot nodded once. "We. And now, the second crime, the attack on Wilcox, confirms it." Inspector Graves rubbed his temples. "Because the killer panicked?" Poirot smiled. "Because the killer is clever, but not clever enough." Miss Bexley suddenly stood, trembling. This has gone too far. I cannot stay. I cannot breathe in this house." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Sit, mademoiselle." "No," she cried. "You cannot keep us here like prisoners." Poirot stepped toward her. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You are frightened. Not because you are guilty, but because you know something." Miss Bexley's eyes filled with tears. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't make me say it." Poirot leaned closer. "You have already said it." Miss Bexley broke into sobs. "I saw someone," she choked. "Not a shadow, not a figure. I saw someone on the landing last night, near Madame's door." Everyone in the room froze. Inspector Graves barked. "Who?" Miss Bexley pointed with a trembling hand at one of the suspects. The room erupted. Poirot did not move. He simply closed his eyes and nodded. "As I expected." Miss Bexley's trembling hand remained lifted, frozen in the air like a figure in a grim tableau. Every eye followed the shaking finger. Poirot did not breathe. Inspector Graves leaned forward, voice sharp as a blade. "Name them." For a moment, Miss Bexley could not speak. Her throat bobbed, her lips trembled, her eyes darted like those of a trapped animal. Finally, in a small, breaking voice, she whispered, "The doctor." A collective gasp burst through the room. Dr. Lionel Ashcroft stiffened, color flooding his normally placid face. His jaw tensed, his fists clenched, his polished composure cracked like thin ice. Poirot did not turn toward him immediately. Instead, he stepped calmly to Miss Bexley's side, gently lowering her trembling hand. "Merci, mademoiselle," he said softly. "You have done what conscience demands." She sank back into her seat, burying her face in her handkerchief. Now Poirot turned and fixed his gaze upon the doctor. Dr. Ashcroft's voice was low, taut with barely controlled anger. "This is absurd. Miss Bexley must have imagined it. I was not on the landing." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Then where were you?" "In my study, writing reports." "At 8 o'clock?" "Yes." Poirot's head tilted. "Alone?" "Of course alone. Doctors often work alone." Poirot stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Doctor, Madame Armitage called for you twice yesterday afternoon. Why?" "She was anxious." "About what?" The doctor hesitated. Poirot's tone sharpened. "The truth, if you please." Dr. Ashcroft looked away for a moment, just a flicker, but enough. She believed someone had entered her room the night before." Another shockwave rippled through the suspects. Poirot's eyes glittered. "And did she say who?" "No," Ashcroft said quickly. "She didn't know." Poirot's gaze stayed locked on him for several long seconds. Then he turned away. Poirot now addressed the room, his voice calm but charged. "My friends, we cannot understand the present without the past. Madame Armitage sealed her windows 23 years ago. Why? Because of the tragedy you all avoid speaking of." He looked at Miss Bexley. "Mademoiselle, you said it was not my concern, but it is entirely my concern." Miss Bexley wiped her eyes. "It was her husband, Mr. Julian Armitage. He died from a fall." Poirot nodded gently. "Continue." "He fell from the second-floor window, this window." She gestured weakly toward the very room they stood in. "It was an accident." Poirot's head moved slowly side to side. "No, mademoiselle. It was never certified as an accident." Dr. Ashcroft's eyes snapped toward him. "What are you implying?" Poirot ignored him and addressed the servants. "The police report stated there were signs of a struggle, a broken latch, a scent in the air. A neighbor saw a figure leaving the gate." Mrs. Lytton gasped. "My mother told me that story." Poirot nodded. "You see, even the shadows of the past resemble those of the present." The doctor bristled. "That was decades ago." Poirot's eyes glittered. "Then let us speak of something else that repeats." He calmly withdrew the empty essential oil vial from his pocket. "This fragrance," he said, "was also present the night Monsieur Armitage died." Dr. Ashcroft froze. Poirot continued, "It was used to mask a chemical, one that could weaken, disorient, or cause a person to lose balance." Rose, the maid, whispered, terrified, "Sir, are you saying—" Poirot's voice was low, ominous. "Yes, Monsieur Armitage did not fall by accident. He was pushed." A horrified chorus swept through the room. "And now," Poirot added, "someone has repeated the same method." Inspector Graves glared at Dr. Ashcroft. "You knew about that old case?" Ashcroft snapped. "I read the file when I began treating Mrs. Armitage. Nothing more." But Poirot was no longer looking at the doctor. He was looking at the note found in Wilcox's pocket. "Meet me by the window latch at 8. Poirot held it up. "One small detail," he said. "Changes everything." He turned the note slowly. "Notice the fold. It is diagonal, not horizontal or vertical. And the paper, thick, heavy, expensive." He lifted the envelope Mrs. Armitage had addressed to him, the one that never left the desk. "Identical paper," Poirot murmured, "from Madame Armitage's personal stationery." Whitcomb blinked. "So she wrote the note." Poirot shook his head. "No, the handwriting is wrong, but someone used her stationery. Someone who had access to the desk drawer." Miss Bexley gasped. "Only I and Mr. Harrington had access." She froze. All eyes turned to Mr. Basil, Harrington, the solicitor. He looked like a man who'd been struck. Poirot nodded slowly. "Oui, monsieur. You had access, and you were alone with that desk 2 days ago." Harrington stammered, I didn't write anything. I didn't—" Poirot raised his hand. "I do not accuse you. Not yet. Then Poirot turned sharply, to someone else. Poirot approached the doctor again, but this time with eerie calm. "Dr. Ashcroft, there is a reason Miss Bexley saw you on the landing." "I've told you, I wasn't there." Poirot shook his head, almost sorrowfully. "No, you were. But you think Miss Bexley saw you." He leaned closer. "When in truth she saw someone wearing your coat." The doctor blinked. "My coat?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, the coat hanging in the cloakroom, the dark wool coat with the torn seam at the cuff." Miss Bexley gasped. "The sleeve, yes, I saw it. I saw the tear." Poirot turned in a slow circle. "And who would wear a doctor's coat? Who would borrow it to cast suspicion?" His voice dropped. "Someone who knew the doctor would become the perfect scapegoat." He paused. "Let the room hold its breath." Then he turned, pointed, straight at Henry Whitcomb. The nephew jolted as though shot. "Me? But you said I didn't kill her." Poirot's voice was cold as winter. "I said you did not directly kill Madame Armitage." He stepped closer. "But you created the false trail. You used the coat. You adjusted the clock. You forged the note to Wilcox. You planted the suspicion upon the doctor." Whitcomb's face drained of color. Poirot continued, voice razor-sharp. "You did everything, except commit the murder." A tremor ran through the room. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "So the question becomes..." He paused. "If Henry did not kill her," he turned to the others, "then who used his deception as a smokescreen to hide their own crime?" The room stood breathless, suspended in a tension so thick it felt like fog. Henry Whitcomb trembled like a man standing far too close to the edge of a cliff. Poirot, however, remained perfectly still, balanced, calm, immovable. "Sit down, Monsieur Whitcomb," he said quietly. Henry obeyed, collapsing into the nearest chair as though his legs no longer obeyed him. Poirot continued, his voice smooth and deliberate. "You crafted a false trail, a clumsy one, but effective enough to cast suspicion on the doctor. You did this to protect yourself from the accusation of stealing your aunt's money." Henry's eyes flashed with shame and panic. Poirot added, "But you did not kill her. Your fear was financial, not murderous." Henry's voice cracked. "Then if I didn't do it, who did?" Poirot turned away, clasping his hands behind his back, and spoke to the entire room. "We now come to the heart of the matter, motive. The true motive, not money, not inheritance, not fear of discovery." He paused. "But vengeance." A ripple of unease swept through the suspects. Poirot stepped toward the center of the room. "For 23 years, this house has been frozen in time. Madame Armitage locked the windows, sealed the curtains, lived in perpetual dread. Not because of grief, no, mes amis, because of guilt." Miss Bexley gasped. "Guilt? Madame never harmed anyone." Poirot turned his gaze upon her gently. But she did. Not by malice, by mistake." He let the room absorb the words. "She believed she caused her husband's death." Mrs. Lytton covered her mouth. The maid whimpered. Dr. Ashcroft froze. Poirot continued. "That night, 23 years ago, Monsieur Armitage was unsteady. He had been drugged, ever so slightly. Enough to weaken his footing, enough to cause confusion, enough to make him fall." Inspector Graves frowned. "Drugged? By who?" Poirot lifted a finger. "By someone who hated him." Everyone leaned forward. "By his daughter." The room exploded into disbelief. Miss Bexley nearly fainted. His daughter? But Mr. and Mrs. Armitage had no child." Poirot corrected her softly. "They had a child before their marriage. A daughter placed quietly with relatives. A family secret buried so deeply that even the servants never heard a whisper." He turned slowly. "This daughter grew up resentful. She believed Monsieur Armitage abandoned her mother. She believed he ruined 2 lives. and when she was old enough, when she found him, she confronted him. Mrs. Lytton whispered, "Are you saying she killed him?" Poirot nodded. She pushed him, not to kill him, but in anger. But the push, combined with the drug, was enough. He fell. He let the memory settle like dust. And Madame Armitage, finding her husband dead beneath an opened window, blamed herself, because she had left the room moments earlier with a scented oil burning. Poirot raised the empty vial. The same scent that was used again last night. Inspector Graves gripped his hat. "But who is this daughter? We don't have her name. We have no evidence she is even alive." Poirot smiled softly. "On the contrary, Inspector, she is very much alive." His eyes traveled slowly across each suspect. "At first, I thought the killer wished to emulate the old tragedy, to unnerve Madame Armitage. But then I realized something deeper, something more diabolical." He paused. "Think of it. Who benefits from Madame Armitage's guilt? Who knew her past intimately? Who understood her phobias, her routines, her inner fears?" A terrible, growing silence. Poirot continued. "The killer manipulated scent because they knew she feared it. They broke the latch because they knew the memory would paralyze her. They opened the window because it would throw her into a panic so severe that her heart, already weak, would falter." Poirot's voice became cold. "The killer didn't need poison or weapons. They used her mind against her." Dr. Ashcroft whispered, "Psychological murder." Poirot nodded. "Exactly." Poirot moved toward the fireplace. For the killer to resurrect an old trauma so perfectly, they needed knowledge. Precise knowledge. Knowledge only one person could possess. He reached behind the mantel clock resting on the mantelpiece. His fingers found a thin wooden box concealed in a gap behind the paneling. The room gasped as Poirot slid it free. "This is Madame Armitage's personal lockbox. Miss Bexley, you never knew of it, did you?" Miss Bexley shook her head violently. "Never." Poirot opened the box. Inside, a faded photograph of a young woman with striking eyes. Letters addressed to "My dearest Cordelia." A birth certificate, a small pressed flower, and a torn half of a letter in handwriting matching the one Wilcox received. Poirot lifted the photograph. "Here," he said softly, "is her daughter." Mrs. Lytton squinted. "She looks familiar." Poirot smiled. "Of course she does." He turned the photograph around so the entire room could see. And the entire room froze, because the woman in the photograph had the same cheekbones, the same brow line, the same intense eyes as Rose Parker, the maid. Rose gasped, then backed into the wall, her hand flying to her mouth. No. Poirot stepped forward. "Yes, mademoiselle. You are her daughter." Rose's face twisted with terror. "Please, Monsieur Poirot, please don't." Poirot raised a hand. "I do not accuse," he said softly. "Not yet." But Rose was shaking violently, her breath ragged. Inspector Graves moved toward her. "Miss Parker," he said firmly, "we need you to stay where—" "Don't come closer," Rose screamed, shoving past him. She stumbled toward the stairs, and then she ran. "After her," Graves barked, but Poirot did not move. He simply turned his head slightly and murmured, "Let her run. Fear runs faster than guilt. She will seek the one place she feels safe." Miss Bexley sobbed. "Where is that?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "Her mother's bedroom." A heavy silence fell. Poirot began walking up the stairs, unhurried. "We shall follow her, mes amis," he said calmly. "And there, I believe, a long-hidden truth awaits us." He paused at the top of the staircase. "And when we find it?" He looked over his shoulder. "We shall find the true murderer." Rose Parker fled up the staircase like a creature driven by pure instinct, not reason. Her footsteps echoed across the landing, toward the closed door of Mrs. Armitage's bedroom, A room sealed even more tightly than the sitting room, a room no servant entered without permission. Poirot ascended after her with deliberate, unhurried steps. Behind him came Inspector Graves, Henry Whitcomb, the doctor, the housekeeper, the solicitor, and finally Mrs. Lytton, who clutched the banister as though the entire affair were a front-row performance staged just for her. Rose reached the door, fumbled with the knob, and slipped inside. The door slammed shut behind her. Poirot stopped before it. He knocked once, softly, almost tenderly. "Rose," he said through the wood, "you are frightened. That I understand. But do not make yourself more afraid than you must be." A shaking voice replied from the other side, "I never meant for her to die." The room behind the door erupted into sobbing. Inspector Graves stiffened. "Open this door, Miss Parker." No one comes in." Poirot raised a hand to silence the inspector. "Rose," he said, "listen to me. I do not think you wanted to kill your mother. I do not think you even hated her. But you know something. Something the true murderer fears." Silence. Then, "You don't understand," Rose whispered. "Oh, but I do," Poirot replied softly. "You discovered the truth, and someone tried to silence you. That is why Wilcox was attacked, because he found out too." The muffled sob grew quieter. Finally, the door clicked. It opened a crack. Poirot pushed it gently. Mrs. Armitage's bedroom was unlike any of the other rooms in Leighton Court. Where the sitting room was dark but functional, the bedroom was frozen in time. Thick curtains shut out the world. Layers of dust clung to the furniture. Photographs, old, fading, lined the dressing table. And in the center of the room, Rose Parker knelt beside the bed, clutching something to her chest. Poirot approached slowly. "What is that, mademoiselle?" he asked gently. Rose lifted the object with trembling hands. It was a diary, Mrs. Armitage's diary. Poirot's eyes softened. Yes, this is what you found." Rose nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't mean to pry. I was cleaning the room last week. The diary slid out from under the mattress. I read it." Poirot glanced at Miss Bexley. "You never cleaned under the mattress, mademoiselle." Miss Bexley flushed. She forbade it. Said it was too private. Poirot nodded. "Yes, and privacy always hides something." He returned his attention to Rose. "What did you learn?" Rose swallowed hard. She had begun writing about the past, about her husband's death, about the daughter she gave away. She said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Poirot listened intently. "She wrote," Rose continued, voice shaking. "Someone was there that night. Someone else opened the window. Someone pushed Julian. I know it now. I remember." The room chilled. Poirot nodded slowly. Then she remembered something dangerous. Rose choked. "And she wrote one more thing, Monsieur Poirot." Her voice broke. She wrote, "He is back." Gasps echoed. Poirot's face hardened. "And that, my friends," he said softly, "is why the murderer acted now." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Rose, who does she mean by he?" Rose shook her head. "I don't know. She didn't write a name, just he." Poirot turned toward the others. His eyes scanned the group. Henry Whitcomb looked terrified. Harrington wrung his hands. Mrs. Lytton leaned forward hungrily. Miss Bexley prayed silently. Dr. Ashcroft's jaw was locked. Poirot's gaze lingered on the doctor just long enough to unsettle him, then moved on. "No," Poirot murmured. "Not yet." He turned toward Rose. "You said you never meant for her to die. Tell me, mademoiselle, what did you intend?" Rose broke down. "I only wanted her to know me," she cried. "I wanted her to know her daughter wasn't a mistake. I wanted to confront her about abandoning me, about never trying to find me, about leaving me with people who didn't want me." Poirot nodded, solemnly. "And did you confront her?" Yes, she sobbed. A week ago. I came to her room at night. She was startled, frightened, but she listened. She asked me to come again. She wanted to explain. She begged me not to tell anyone. Poirot stepped closer. You argued. Rose nodded miserably. I shouted. I said I hated her. I didn't mean it. I was angry, but I left. She cried. I heard her crying. Poirot's voice was gentle. And the night she died? Rose's breath hitched. I never went near her. I swear it. Poirot nodded. I believe you. Inspector Graves groaned. Poirot, are you serious? She had every reason, every motive. Yes, Poirot interrupted sharply. But she lacks one thing. He raised a finger. The intelligence. Rose blinked, offended. Monsieur Poirot. Poirot softened slightly. I mean only this, mademoiselle. The murderer is cunning. Very cunning. They plotted meticulously. They recreated a trauma from 23 years ago. They manipulated scent, memory, even the clocks. Poirot's gaze swept the room. Rose did not orchestrate such a plan. She is impulsive, emotional, honest, even in anger. No, someone used her presence as a convenient mask. Henry Whitcomb whispered, I don't understand. Poirot replied, the murderer needed Rose to appear as the obvious suspect, the forgotten daughter with a grudge, an irresistible narrative. Inspector Graves muttered, Then who? Poirot lifted the diary, flipping through its pages. Halfway through, he stopped. There, pressed between 2 pages, was a folded scrap of paper. Poirot removed it. A torn half-letter, the missing half of the torn note from the sitting room. Poirot unfolded it. Words scrawled in shaky handwriting. I know it was you that night. You were there. You opened the window. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. And you killed him. Silence drowned the room. Everyone leaned in as Poirot continued reading. I remember your voice. Poirot lowered the paper slowly. He turned his head, his eyes locked onto one person, and that person stiffened, visibly, instinctively, guiltily. Poirot's voice was soft. Madame, you remember a voice from 23 years ago? Then it could only be... He pointed, straight at Mrs. Nora Lytton. The neighbor. Shrieks erupted. Mrs. Lytton staggered back, hand on her chest. Me? Are you mad? I wasn't even... Poirot raised a hand. Oh, but you were, madame. His voice was calm now, cold, certain. You were there that night. You saw Julian Armitage fall. You saw his daughter flee. You hid the truth for 23 years. Mrs. Lytton shook her head wildly. No. Poirot's finger lowered. Because you were not merely a neighbor. His voice became a blade. You were Julian Armitage's lover. The room exploded. Mrs. Lytton collapsed against the wall. Poirot stepped closer. You had the strongest motive of all, and the most to lose. Her eyes filled with horror, because she knew Poirot was right. Mrs. Nora Lytton pressed herself against the floral wallpaper as though the patterns might swallow her whole. Her normally sharp, bright eyes were wide, unfocused, wild. A woman who had spent decades controlling the narrative of an entire neighborhood was, at last, cornered. Poirot stepped toward her with the unhurried calm of a man who has solved the puzzle long before the others even recognized its shape. Madame Lytton, he said softly, you have hidden the truth for many years. But guilt, it is like a mouse in the skirting boards. It gnaws, it scratches. Eventually, no wallpaper is thick enough to hide the holes. Mrs. Lytton shook her head violently. No, you've misunderstood. Completely misunderstood. I was not his lover. I barely knew the man. Poirot's mustache twitched. Madame, forgive me, but you are a poor liar. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Lytton's hands curled into trembling claws. I swear on my life, I had nothing to do with it. Poirot nodded once. Precisely. That is the issue. You swear on your life, but not on his. Never on his." Mrs. Lytton froze. Poirot turned slightly, addressing the room. 23 years ago, Mrs. Cordelia Armitage discovered her husband's affair. A simple thing, a letter mislaid, or a whisper overheard. But she discovered it. Miss Bexley gasped. "Madame, but she loved him." "She loved him with the ferocity of a woman who fears abandonment," Poirot replied calmly. "Which is why she hid the truth. She preferred guilt to humiliation." Poirot paced a few steps, hands clasped neatly behind his back. Julian Armitage's lover lived across the street, a married woman at the time, respectable, sharp-tongued, and observant, always observant. He turned. Madame Lytton was that woman. Mrs. Lytton crumpled into a chair, face ashen. It was a mistake," she whispered. "A foolish mistake. It was brief. He ended it. He said he wanted to repair his marriage." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and that is why you confronted him the night he died." Mrs. Lytton flinched. The room erupted. Poirot raised his hand for silence. "You came to the side gate so no one would see you. You entered through the servants' corridor. You and Julian argued. Voices were raised." Poirot lifted the essential oil vial. He had begun using this fragrance to calm his wife, but the scent unsettled her. "You hated it. You accused him of being controlled by his wife, of losing himself." Mrs. Lytton's voice cracked. I only wanted to speak to him." "You pushed him," Poirot said coldly. She covered her face. "I didn't mean to." He stepped back. He lost his footing. That window latch. It broke, and he fell. Poirot nodded sadly. Yes, but it was a crime nonetheless. Inspector Graves gripped her shoulder. "You should have come forward." Mrs. Lytton sobbed. "I was terrified. Terrified he'd tell my husband. Terrified the whole neighborhood would know. Terrified Cordelia would expose me. I ran. I fled through the side gate. I never went to the police." Poirot's voice remained soft. And so Madame Armitage was left to believe she caused the tragedy, because she had just left the room with the fragrance burning. Tears streamed down Rose's face. Poirot continued, and now, 23 years later, Madame Armitage remembered the truth. She wrote in her diary, "I remember your voice." Mrs. Lytton's face twisted. I didn't know she remembered. I didn't know she wrote that down." Poirot's eyes glinted. "But you learned when you found this." He held up the first torn corner of the letter, the piece found beside the chair. Mrs. Lytton stared at it, trembling. Poirot explained, "You visited her 2 days ago. You said it was merely to check on her. But you saw the letter she was writing, to me. You tore a corner as you tried to read it before she snatched it back." Poirot lowered the paper, and you knew then she was calling for Hercule Poirot. A shudder passed through Mrs. Lytton. Poirot stepped closer. "You panicked. You needed to frighten her into a fatal attack of the heart. Something she had always feared. Something connected to her trauma." He touched the window latch. "You recreated the scene. You opened the window." He touched the vial. "You released the scent." He touched the broken clock on the table. "You tampered with the time." He gestured to Rose. "And you allowed suspicion to fall on the forgotten daughter." Mrs. Lytton finally broke. She screamed, an unhinged, soul-wrenching cry. "I didn't wake intending to kill her, I swear it, but when I saw that letter, when I read her words, I realized she would ruin my life. Again, after all these years." Poirot nodded slowly, sadly. "You wished to destroy her before she destroyed you." Graves grabbed Mrs. Lytton's arms. "You're under arrest for the murder of Cordelia Armitage." Mrs. Lytton collapsed against him, sobbing. "It wasn't murder. It was just, Poirot finished for her. Desperation. She let out a broken wail. As Graves signaled for the constables outside, Poirot raised one hand. Un moment, Inspector. The room paused. Poirot turned toward Henry Whitcomb, Rose Parker, Dr. Ashcroft, Miss Bexley, Harrington. There is one last detail, he said quietly. Everyone stiffened. Poirot smiled faintly. Mrs. Lytton killed Madame Armitage, but she did not attack the butler. Shock rippled anew. Mrs. Lytton looked up, confused. What? I didn't touch him. Poirot nodded. I know. He turned, slowly, toward the real culprit of the second crime, someone whose face was already draining of color. Poirot lifted his chin. And now, he said softly, we unmask the one who tried to silence Wilcox. He pointed, straight at Dr. Lionel Ashcroft. The room, which had only just begun to recover from Mrs. Lytton's confession, froze once more. All heads turned. Dr. Lionel Ashcroft, so composed, so dignified, now stood pale as candle wax, his breath caught somewhere between denial and dread. His hands twitched at his sides. Poirot approached him with that unmistakable confidence, a soft, deadly tread that signaled the endgame. Doctor, he said gently, you wished the murderer revealed, did you not? Ashcroft swallowed. Eyes, of course, but this is madness. I had nothing to do with any of this. Poirot tilted his head. Ah, you claim innocence, and yet you attempted to murder the butler. Why? More shockwaves through the room. Rose gasped. Miss Bexley covered her mouth. Harrington muttered, Good heavens! Ashcroft's voice cracked. I never touched Wilcox. Poirot raised a hand. Come, Doctor, let us tidy the facts. Poirot lifted his fingers one by one as though counting steps down a staircase. First, he said, you were the only person who had access to the sedatives strong enough to render Wilcox unconscious so quickly without leaving marks. Ashcroft sputtered. I prescribe medicines, but not to Wilcox. Poirot cut in. Yet you keep samples. You used one, a small amount, enough to cause collapse. He lowered his second finger. Second, the scratch on the servant's staircase. A man of your height would hold the handrail exactly where we found the thread from your coat. The doctor's eyes widened. Poirot lifted a third finger. Third, you are the only person in the household who knew Madame Armitage's true medical condition. Her heart's fragility, her fear reflex, her vulnerability to psychological shock. He paused. Mrs. Lytton knew her trauma, but you knew her weaknesses. A murmur ran through the suspects. Poirot lifted a fourth finger. Fourth, the night of the murder, you claimed not to smell the strange fragrance, but you were the one who supplied her with essential oils for months to relax her. Poirot picked up the empty vial. This blend is not calming. It is designed to agitate the nerves. You knew that. The doctor's face contorted. Poirot's final finger lifted. And finally, Doctor, his voice dropped to a whisper. You stood to gain far more than we first realized. He turned to Inspector Graves. Inspector, do you recall the financial records we examined? Graves nodded sharply. Yes, the doctor was receiving, monthly payments from Mrs. Armitage's medical fund. Very generous ones. Poirot nodded. Ah, yes, generous indeed. Because Madame Armitage trusted her physician completely. He stepped closer to Ashcroft. Too completely. Poirot stepped aside, making a small gesture toward Rose Parker. Rose, would you be so good as to read aloud the final page of Madame Armitage's diary? Rose, trembling, opened the diary at the marked page. Her voice shook but remained clear. I no longer believe my husband died by accident. I remember a voice, a calm voice telling him to step back, telling him the window was safe. I remember seeing Lionel Ashcroft in the garden that night. A wave of horrified silence. Dr. Ashcroft's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the dresser. No. She was delirious. She confused memory. Poirot cut in sharply. No, Doctor. You confused her memory for years, with medicines, with manipulations, with your soft, persuasive voice. Poirot turned to the others. 23 years ago, Lionel Ashcroft was a young medical intern. He lived 2 streets away. He fancied himself indispensable to the Armitage family. When Julian Armitage threatened to expose his questionable treatments, Ashcroft panicked. Poirot's voice turned cold. He confronted Julian at that window, a push, understated but deliberate, and the deed was done. Rose gasped. But Madame Armitage blamed herself. Poirot nodded. Because the doctor allowed it. He stepped closer to Ashcroft. And when she finally remembered, when she wrote that she saw you that night, your empire of lies trembled. Poirot straightened. You panicked. He lifted the vial. You recreated the past. You tried to blame others. You let Mrs. Lytton's guilt distract from your own. You used Rose's existence as a smoke screen. He clicked the vial shut. And then you tried to silence the butler. Inspector Graves seized Ashcroft's arm. The doctor sagged. Then, he snapped. You think I meant to kill her? Ashcroft spat suddenly. She was a paranoid, neurotic woman. She saw ghosts in shadows. Poirot replied gently. But in the end, she remembered the real ghost. You. Ashcroft trembled. His voice rose. She would have ruined me. She would have destroyed everything. I devoted years to that woman. Poirot shook his head. No, Doctor. You devoted years to control. Ashcroft screamed. I did what I had to do. Poirot's voice was a whisper of steel. Yes, a murderer always tells himself that. Inspector Graves snapped handcuffs onto the doctor's wrists. Ashcroft slumped, defeated. Mrs. Lytton was escorted away separately, her crime not murder, but manslaughter, sorrow, fear, and concealment. Rose, pale but relieved, sank into a chair. Poirot touched her shoulder gently. You, mademoiselle, are guilty only of wanting a mother who could love you. Now you will have the chance to build a life without shadows. Rose burst into tears. Henry Whitcomb approached her awkwardly. We're family, aren't we? He said. Rose nodded, timid. Poirot smiled faintly. A fractured family can be repaired if the pieces wish to join. Henry swallowed. I'd like to try. Poirot stepped back. Miss Bexley approached, wiping tears. Monsieur Poirot, how did you see it all? Poirot straightened his cuffs. I use my little grey cells, mademoiselle. They do not lie. Facts may be twisted. People may deceive. But human nature reveals all. He glanced at the window that had remained closed for 23 years. Madame Armitage lived in darkness because she feared the truth would destroy her. But in the end, he touched the drape gently. It was the truth that set her free. Poirot turned toward the door. Inspector Graves shook his head. Poirot, I don't know how you do it. Poirot smiled. It is simple, Inspector. One sees order where others see chaos. As he walked down the stairs, cane tapping softly, he added, and where others see windows closed. He opened the front door to the sunlight. I see windows waiting to be opened. Poirot stepped into the daylight, immaculate as ever.